Thanks everybody for joining. I'm happy to be involved in the Enterprise Agility Everywhere conference this year. In spite of the setbacks, we're able to still produce content for everybody and have a large audience. And so I really appreciate your participation. Today I want to talk about acts of leadership that you as a manager or as a coach can take to make a difference in whether or not implementation of new practices and adoption of these new practices will actually happen in your company, and so that you can get results that you're looking for. It's not easy. It's not easy to get other people to change things, but we have developed a path to follow, and I'm going to talk through that in somewhat specific terms to make it clear how the stuff works. So, why don't people adopt practices that are going to help, that'll make things better? And who is able to take responsibility for that, in getting people to try and make a difference, try new things? And how do you get people to do that? How do you get people to change their opinions? I'm going to talk about like I said, specific practices in concrete terms, to an example of how you can influence people, how you can make that difference. So even when people know that some new method, new practice, new tool will help them, even when they've been trained, they understand it, there's a coach right there talking to them, it's very common that they don't adopt it, that they don't try it out, or they give up kind of easily. Why is that? Why won't people do things that they know could help them? And I think we can summarize it as the values, the benefits behind what those practices are designed to achieve aren't interesting to them, or they're not aware of it, or they don't care enough. And let me define what values are. We have in the Kanban maturity model, there's values like customer service. Ask anybody if they care about customer service, they will tell you yes. But what do we mean by values? Values are, if we can easily summarize it, these are things that people believe matter. They think it will make a difference. They think it's important. And so, for example, if people don't think that transparency matters, especially if they think it's actually bad, that transparency will make things worse, they're not going to adopt practices to increase transparency. Conversely, if they believe that transparency is going to help them, that having more transparency, they value transparency because it is going to make things better. It's going to solve their problems. They will look for ways to increase transparency. That's why values are a critical part of organizational change. People need to care about what they're going to get. They need to be actively pursuing that kind of thing, or they're just going to reject the change because change is extra work. It's harder. So whose job is it to influence whether or not people value things like transparency? Well, the answer should be obvious. It's leaders. But let me explain and define, what is a leader. So a leader is somebody who makes decisions. And part of those decisions, I would say, also include things like defining things. So, for example, when is something done? Or deciding, we're not going to do this, but we will do this. Those kinds of decisions. This is what's important, or this is the definition of good enough. Leaders define and decide those kinds of things, but they also influence others. Others need to agree with them. If a leader is not getting others to listen and follow and agree and pursue the goals that the leader has, they're not really leading. Is that something you can do? Are you able to do that? I think, yeah. I think anybody can learn how to do this. And so how can you get people to adopt these changes? Well, the good news is there's a map. There's a map that can show you at least some ways to help get people to start wanting the improvements, wanting the benefits of some new practices, not just something indirect like better results from the team or less overburden, being more fit for purpose, but wanting the values like transparency or respect, uh, basic understanding, those kinds of things. We have a map for that. And David Anderson and Teodora Bojeva have put a tremendous amount of work in taking really more than 10 years of experience from well over 100 people around the world in different industries to gather this information, gather what is it that managers and Kanban coaches have done to help companies make improvements, and what were the practices that they actually used, and they sort of normalized and codified those, and then what was the approach that they took that got it to work. That's what this maturity model maps for you. And inside the maturity model, it's is architected the evolutionary change model, which is based on the formula for evolutionary change, which is you need some kind of a stressor, something to avoid or get away from, a stressor, a reflection mechanism to understand, well, what is this problem, and then some type of leadership to direct the new, away from the stressor and towards a new equilibrium. And architected into the maturity model are two types of practices. There's the transition practices, which a coach or a manager can introduce and push on people, and a little that little bit of pushing, they apply that pressure, that stress, until people are saying, I need relief. This problem that I see now, because of these transition practices, I want to solve it. I want something to relieve this. And that's what the consolidation practices will do. So inside, there's this architecture in the maturity model. It's organized to reach this point. This is the goal. You want somebody, at least somebody, to be willing to take initiative or willing to lead others to sort out and solve the problem, to apply the new practices. This is a very old cartoon in Kanban land. It's on the original book, and there's a lot of wisdom in there. So let's see. So how do you get people to that state? How do you get people to be saying, this is our problems, let's do something about it? What actions can you take? So we'll go through an example of that. But let's take a moment to just look at this situation here. Let's use the Kanban cartoon as the example of how to apply transition practices and to get people to get to the point where they want to implement some type of a new practice, a new change. What's the chief complaint here? What's the problem? Somebody saying I'm stuck. Somebody says I'm too busy. Somebody says I'm idle. Maybe it's the columns that they're standing in front of. Somebody saying let's do something about it. What's going on here? What's the problem? How would you assess this situation? Well, I'd say the chief complaint essentially is they can't get their work done. They can't seem to get their work done. I would suggest most likely their outcomes are going to be inconsistent. A ticket can come onto this board. How long does it take to get it done? The process, to me, there's some process mapped here and modeled in some way. Maybe this is a basic idea. It might be based on which skills happen in which sequence, but how does the work actually flow through here? What are the expectations about it? I don't think that that's necessarily clear. It's not visible there, at least. They don't seem to have an answer already. They're looking for an answer to solve those workflow problems. And then finally, the capacity. I'd say, no one's really in control of the capacity. The large volume of tickets in Analyze, there's no constraint on that. Clearly, they're receiving more requests than they can deliver. There's an imbalance there. It's not there's nothing to balance that. There's no control of the capacity. And what are people working on? No control of that is visible there. That's maturity level 1, which can be defined as processes are emerging, meaning they're inconsistent, and maybe they're being defined now. They may be vague. The outcomes are going to be inconsistent. And in order to get work done, to actually finish something, you probably have to rely on heroics. Somebody stepping up and taking more initiative, people working, taking the work and doing it themselves over the weekend, for example, or some manager stepping in. But you're going to rely on some heroics for that. That's maturity level 1. So sticking with the maturity model, let's see, what practices are they doing now that we know what maturity level they are? Well, zooming into the maturity model, the specific practices poster specifically, if we're at maturity level 1, let's take a look at what do we see them doing? It does, we do see they've got a team Kanban board. Everybody's standing around it. It's unclear who's doing what work, so there's nothing there for that. Basic policies, at the very least, there's analysis happens before we start developing. You have to test the work that you develop. That we can assume that. Multiple individuals involved, so we could see those kinds of practices in place. And we can take a look at some more of the practices. Now we're away from visualization. There are other general practices. There's limiting WIP, managing flow, making policies explicit, feedback loops, and there's another one. If you know it, you get a cookie. But for limiting WIP, there's absolutely no sign that there's any limiting of WIP at all. Policies about capacity or limiting WIP aren't clear. What to do if you end up with problems or you get stuck. It's unclear that there's any definition of real policies in place. Looks to me like this is a Kanban meeting. It may be the first initial one and it's ad hoc, but let's assume it's an actual Kanban meeting. And whether or not these activities are happening here, it's unlikely that there's any type of replenishment. The overstuffed analysis column makes it seem like there's not really any deliberate replenishment. Theme retrospectives, what would they have to look at other than potentially like the meeting they're having now, which is complaining about things. So they're not really doing a whole lot. It looks as if potentially they've got some basic visualizations and boards and some tickets, essential or basic workflow in place, and then some personal meetings discussing the stuff, but that's about it. So, given what their problem is, their chief complaint is, they're not getting work done. What would be their next step? What should they do? Well, what are they doing? They're complaining. They're saying, this isn't working. We should do something about it. So they're not even really solid at level 1. Maturity level 1. So let's say they implement some practices to improve maturity level 1. What kind of results are they going to get? they'll have emergent practices, emergent process. They'll have inconsistent outcomes, and they're going to rely on heroes. So why put the effort into improving their maturity level 1 organization? This is the reason why Kanban method and the training you get from Kanban University, it starts at level 2. And the first thing we do is, other than an orientation to how Kanban works, is what's wrong? What's the problem? And so in the cartoon, they're actually starting right here, or they could be, if somebody took advantage of their complaints and turned it into the improve and evolve practice 2.1 and identify sources of dissatisfaction. So they're already started. They're already doing it, listing their complaints, and in the basic level training from Kanban, that's where we start. The first question we ask is, what are the problems? What do you have to complain about, essentially? That's the systems thinking approach to implementing Kanban. That's static. It's fundamental Kanban method. And so in the case of this Kanban cartoon, maybe they've already done static. Maybe they already took the class. They took Kanban management professional training. They've visualized their work. Maybe what they've done is implemented Jira, for example, but they don't have WIP limits. They don't have a really clear sense of what their process is. Nobody has any idea how long it takes to get work done. In that circumstance, you should apply static again, more analysis, get a deeper understanding of what you're doing. Static is meant to be iterative. So even if the condition that they're in the cartoon with those columns and those tickets, if they use static to get there, they could use static again. And they also should apply the steps and the practices of static because they need to know certain things. They need to have some answers before they can really apply solutions properly and even know which specific practices they should apply. And they can complain, they can articulate, I'm stuck. Or they could say, I'm too busy. They could think, I shouldn't be this busy. But what they need to understand is what causes these large stacks of analysis work. Why are there so many requests in analysis, especially in relation to the rest of the workflow? What's causing that? Who's making these requests? What exactly are these requests? Are they all the same? What should be the expectations about that giant stack of work there in analysis? And what's keeping the work from completing its current state and moving to the next state? What's stopping it? What's in the way? Is the work too hard? It takes a long time to get the work done, or is there something else? So given the ability to take a look at a situation like what you see in the Kanban cartoon and apply some thinking and analysis from the lens of the Kanban maturity model, what can you do about this? Well, help them adopt new practices. That's going to solve the problems that they think matter. This is a common issue with coaches, especially, and managers, is they have some ideal of how things should be, and they want to implement that. They want to realize their vision. But people need to think that what you're trying to do is worth it, that it's going to help. They need to believe that. So how might it look to apply practices in such a way that you start to increase people's interest and willingness to implement some real changes that will make a difference? Well, first you can start with visualizing, so what's actually happening here? I mean, we could see a bunch of tickets and then not so many tickets. We could see that, but what's going on? So here's a list of some transition practices that will help achieve maturity level 2, which would at least be consistent process, some control over that. So the first one, visualize the work through delivery with per person WIP limits. So introducing some WIP limits, or at least seeing who's working on what. Visualizing blocked work items. Is that what some of the problem is? Is the work is actually blocked? Visualize work item aging. Let's say the third from the bottom ticket in the analysis column. How old is that? How long has it been in there? And then, using avatars, images of people, like who's doing what kind of work on an upstream Kanban board. We don't even have that in the Kanban cartoon. So, here's one way some of that visualization might manifest. The ticket design. On the bottom left, you can see ticket aging. So this, how old is this ticket? You can physically do this with a real ticket, pen. Different features and different software will fade a ticket or turn it red or something like that to show you that this is old. Like turning it red, you need to define how old is too old. You need to know that. Letting it fade, that's just, relatively speaking, how long has it been up there? For blockers, is it blocked or not? Compared to everything else, is this one blocked? You notice there's a date on there. When was it blocked? There's even a counter. How many days has it been blocked? But that's one way it could be manifested. But there are other general practices. It's not just visualize. And that might be one of the issues with the Kanban cartoon team, is they don't necessarily have an awareness of the other general practices to apply. So, for example, the FL stands for feedback loops. It's one of the general practices is implementing feedback loops. Conduct an internal team replenishment, internal workflow replenishment. So at least at the local level, get some control over how you're allocating or how you're spending your capacity. What work are you doing? And be deliberate about that. This means, specifically allow the service team, to select the work requests from the backlog into a next column. And that means this is, for example, what I've taken from the buffet and put on my plate. Now I'll go back to the table and finish everything on my plate. Another managed flow is the MF practice 2.3. Model the upstream and the downstream. So what we're looking at here is potentially the same workflow, starting with analysis, development, testing, UAT. But downstream from UAT, so user acceptance testing, that's some type of approval process. Is it approved? Is the work approved or not? Let's say you've done some work and it wasn't good enough, or there's a problem. What happens? It's not done, is it? So having some clear demarcation or acknowledgement of this is actually done. It has met the standard. It was good enough. Clarifying that. It means there's not the risk of this coming back to us necessarily. Of course, there's always that type of a risk, but it's diminished. But then upstream, and this is partly what we were just talking about, adding this next column for internal replenishment. But let's think about it this way. Maybe this backlog, this next column, and this analysis column on the Kanban cartoon, maybe that was all the same thing. Maybe if somebody had an idea, they put their idea in the analysis column because there was nowhere else for it to go. That might be the reason why there's so many in there. And maybe there's no expectation to even start most of them, but maybe there is. We don't know. So modeling this will make it more clear. And also, which of those tickets is finished? How do you know if analysis is done or not? So adding that in there. So by making the entry into analysis more explicit, by adding some stages of the workflow beforehand in the upstream Kanban, that can also help. And so in summary, there are some points that I hope you don't forget that I wanted to make here. But the first is that, you know, influencing other people is really one of the definitions of leadership. And people need to have their attention drawn to what matters. They need to, you know, you can say foster some values, but they need somebody showing them this matters. Transparency is going to help us. You know, limiting our whip is going to get things under control. Collaborating is going to help us get things done without having to do it yourself all weekend. Transparency is going to get people off our backs potentially. And when they recognize that, they may see this is, you know, if we had transparency, that would make all the difference. It's actually a quote from somebody. And then the leader is the one who communicates that well enough so that people's opinions change, or what they want to pursue, it changes. A leader is somebody who does that, and that could be you. And the other nice thing is that it's not only talking. You don't have to be a gifted speaker or a very charismatic, persuasive person to lead other people. You just need to know what practices to implement. So, you know, talking isn't the only way. The KMM transition practices specifically are organized and illustrated, enumerated, to help give you some guidance of what actions you could take that will increase people's awareness of these, you know, what values matter, and increase people's desire to, you know, do something about it. The transition practices are things that a non-skilled orator, somebody who's not an excellent speaker, somebody who's not a persuasive personality, you can, for example, I like to say, overnight, you can sneak into the office and put some black dots next to a blocked ticket for every day it's been blocked. And no, you don't even have to tell anybody that you're doing that. And at some point, people will recognize, hey, this blocked ticket has 16 hash marks on it. What does that mean? And maybe they're not going to like the answer, that it's been blocked for 16 days, and they're going to want to do something about it. So you can take these transition practices, and the way we phrase it is push a little, push a little bit on the status quo, and that will inspire a desire to do something about it. And that's really how you can teach or foster or influence the values that people have, is, you know, through some of these actions. You don't have to get a poster that has a value on it, or teach a class where you click through slides that list all the values. You can just take actions, especially actions towards work that's within your span of influence, within your control. That's your goal. So in this case, I'd like to get towards closing. Who's the manager here? Or maybe there isn't a manager, but who's a coach? Who is it? You might think, oh, it's the person saying, let's do something about it. Well, maybe not. You might think it's a person with a tie, but that doesn't mean anything. I would think it's probably not Shaggy, but I have lived for a decade in Silicon Valley, and probably Shaggy is the CEO. The question is, or the point is, who's the manager? And who's the coach? Who's the one who's been pushing these practices that got them to this point where they're saying what their problems are? They're essentially starting static. These are my source of dissatisfaction. And they've inspired an act of leadership. How did that come to be? The person who did that may not even be there. But what's causing it is visualization of the total lack of balance between demand and capability. the transparency into, hey, I've got no work to do, and the transparency into this is not this is a broken process. That's what caused this, and it doesn't have to be the manager, with the job title manager. That didn't have to be the one who did this. Didn't have to be the coach either. And that's the benefit. We know that this works because we've seen it working for 10 years. And that's what the Kanban maturity model illustrates and organizes. But if you get them to this point, you better be prepared to help them adopt the right practice. Maybe they're thinking, oh, our solution to this problem, Monte Carlo simulations, because I read about it in a blog. You have to make sure that they're ready to adopt a practice that's going to make a difference, that's going to help them, help the problem that they've got. And they've got maturity level 1 problems. So they need those kinds of solutions. So you should study. You should learn how these practices work. You should learn how to explain them to people, learn different ways that they can be implemented, because maybe you're not using paper and sticky notes. Maybe you're using Jira. How do you implement these practices in the tools that you've got, in the circumstances you've got? And make sure you don't make things worse. Again, the ambitious manager, the ambitious coach, it's a chronic, classic problem of overreaching. I've got this solution. If only we could just do this. If we could adopt a Spotify model, if we could get, a learning organization with servant leaders from top to bottom in this company, and we'd sharpen the saw all day long, everything would be great. But when people don't know who's working on what, maybe all you need to do is write people's names on what they're doing. So find the right fit. What's the appropriate practice for the problem that they are willing to solve? Because if they say, I am stuck, I can't move forward with my work, and then you try to solve some other problem, they're probably not going to be interested in asking you for help in the future. So make sure you understand the levels and the appropriateness of the practices given the maturity levels. So thank you. Thank you very much for signing in and logging into the training. And I hope that you're inspired to take a deeper look into the maturity model and how it can work for you. And if you would like any more information about it, please get in contact with me. You can contact me through Twitter, that's easy, through my email. You can contact with the company, David Janderson School of Management. We offer trainings. Get in contact with the greater Kanban community, those who are here at the conference virtually, and on LinkedIn as well. But please, get in contact and let's do something about it. Thank you.